Thank you. The next item of business is a debate on motion 16923 in the name of Angus Robertson on Scotland, a fair trade nation. I would invite those members who would wish to speak in the debate to please press the request to speak buttons, and I call on Cabinet Secretary Angus Robertson to speak to and to move the motion. Around 13 minutes, please.
Many thanks, Presiding Officer. I'm proud to have the opportunity to open this debate this afternoon. Scotland, a fair trade nation, to celebrate Scotland's renewed status as a fair trade nation and move the motion standing in my name. The title of the debate, Scotland has held for over a decade, and one which we share with only one other nation, namely our friends in Wales. But being a fair trade nation is about more than just a title, and the motion for today's debate recognises the dedication and the hard work of fair trade campaigners, of businesses and communities across Scotland to achieving and, importantly, sustaining fair trade nation status. And I had the chance to meet some of them at a reception ahead of this debate, and delighted to see them in the gallery today. So a big thank you for their work to champion the cause of fairness in global trade, and I look forward to hearing more about their efforts from colleagues across the parties in the Chamber today. I'd also like to thank Scottish Fair Trade for their leadership in promoting and strengthening Scotland's fair trade commitment. The report, Is Scotland Still a Fair Trade Nation?, published earlier this month, notes that 97% of the Scottish population have heard of fair trade. And this in itself is a phenomenal result and reflects the work of Scottish Fair Trade and its members to ensure that fair trade remains at the forefront of people's minds. The report also reminds us of the turbulent context within which renewed fair nation status was achieved. It's been 7 years since the last assessment. Since then, there have obviously been Brexit, trade realignments, the economic and social disruption caused by the COVID-19 pandemic, and the heightened urgency of the climate emergency. All of this during a period of unprecedented upheaval. And yet, in the face of these immense challenges, Scottish civic society has held fast to their commitment to justice and equity in trade. This year also marks a significant milestone in terms of Scotland's commitment to addressing poverty and inequality overseas, the 20th anniversary of the Scottish Government's International Development Programme. And this milestone isn't just significant for Government, but also for this Parliament. 20 years ago, the G8 met at Gleneagles to discuss the challenges Africa was facing. Shortly after, the Scottish Parliament hosted Malawi After Gleneagles, an event which brought together key Scots and Malawians from across government, parliament and also civic society. The approach mapped out at that event, with a clear focus on people-to-people and dignified reciprocal partnership, has guided our international development work ever since, and it's reflected in our new international development principles that we co-developed with our partner countries and Scottish INGOs in 2021. At that Scottish Parliament event in 2005, the then First Minister of Scotland, the Right Honourable Jack McConnell, made a point which is as true then as it is now. He said, and I quote, "The primary duty of this Parliament and our devolved government is to use our powers for the betterment of the people of Scotland. But we have another duty too, as elected politicians and as citizens of the world, a duty to be good neighbours and to play our part in global challenges." Strong cross-party support for international development in the Scottish Parliament has been a feature underpinning successive Scottish Governments' international development work since 2005. It's been fundamental to the programme and therefore to the difference the contributions from Scotland have made over these 2 decades, both to the lives of those living in our partner countries and to those communities living through humanitarian crises through our wider aid. My express hope is that the Scottish Parliament continues our proud tradition of supporting our partner countries for the benefit of the most vulnerable communities globally, and that this Parliament continues to show leadership on the global stage. Members here today will, I'm sure, share the same concerns about the deteriorating global order at this time and the cuts to aid that have been made over the last weeks by governments around the world. The freeze and now newly announced termination of 83% of US aid spend has seen the largest donor of humanitarian and development assistance pause, then cancel the majority of its programming. And we know that this will have a serious impact globally on the most vulnerable, including in our partner countries. The further cuts in aid, most recently announced by the UK Government, now dropping from 0.5% to 0.3% of UK GNI being spent on overseas development aid, will further compound this. On the part of the Scottish Government, we have been clear that while we welcome the UK Government's commitment to increased defence spending at a time of such acute need across Europe, we are deeply disappointed at this cut to the overseas aid budget, the lowest percentage of UK finance spent on aid in over a quarter of a century. This is a time when globally we all need to be stepping up to support the poorest and the most vulnerable communities in the world. And one of the simplest ways we can do this as a nation is through our support of fair trade. By promoting and purchasing fair trade, we are supporting producers, workers and enterprises, in particular in the Global South, to build a fairer, more sustainable trading system, one that supports the rights, dignity and livelihoods of those throughout the supply chain. And businesses, schools, churches and local communities across Scotland are doing just that. The assessment report, Is Scotland Still a Fair Trade Nation?, notes that 22 of Scotland's 32 local authority areas have fair trade activity regularly happening in them. This level of civic engagement across all sectors of society in Scotland speaks to the deep and the unwavering commitment to justice and equity in trade that exists across our communities. Edinburgh, of course.
John Mason.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for giving way. I agree with a lot of what he said. I mean, he's mentioned how much there is activity in so many local authorities, but would you accept it's quite a low bar? It doesn't need to be an awful lot of activity.
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, I would agree with them that the level of support will vary from one part of the country to the other. I'd perhaps springboard off his intervention to encourage those local authorities that are not yet playing a part to begin to do so, and then hopefully through encouragement and with the support of campaigners we can broaden, widen and enhance the fair trade movement's impact right across Scotland. He's right to wish us increase it, and I would very much welcome those minority of local government areas in Scotland that are not yet part of the process to do so in the future. In Edinburgh, where my own constituency is based here in Edinburgh Central, obtained fair trade status as far back as 2004, and I commend the work of the Edinburgh City Fair Trade City Steering Group for its work to support and to promote fair trade across the city. In particular, I want to congratulate the Steering Group and Scottish Fair Trade for their successful bid to host the International Fair Trade Towns Conference in Edinburgh later this year. And this will be the first time that this prestigious event will have been held in Scotland. Today's global challenges, climate change, pandemics, conflict, poverty, inequality, can only be addressed if the Global South and the Global North work together. And, of course.
Willie Rennie.
The Minister will have seen reports today challenging Ed Miliband around about the solar panels that are sourced from China. Has he reassured himself about the source of solar panels that are purchased through government schemes here in Scotland?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, I'm grateful for Willie Rennie raising this issue. I have a confession to make. I have not read those reports yet, but he's raised them with me. I give him a commitment to do so, and I'll look closely at the points that he raises. I'm just being frank with him. I haven't yet read those reports. Fair trade, with its focus on global solidarity and marginalised producers, is an important part of our international development programme alongside other key areas. And over the last year, we've launched new programmes on health and inclusive education, from new strategic partnerships with the World Bank on education to support at very local levels for girls and learners with disabilities to better access school, and from a new strategic partnership with the World Health Organization on non-communicable diseases to developing community palliative care within our partner countries. Beyond our support for our partners' countries through longer-term programming, we've continued to also contribute globally where humanitarian crises occur. 2024 was reported to have the highest number of countries engaged in conflict since the end of World War II, and climate change is increasing the risk of conflict with more frequent extreme weather events and the world hitting 1.5 degrees for the first time last year. According to the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs' December 2024 report, 305.1 million people are expected to require immediate humanitarian assistance in 2025. We've continued to respond to global crises principally through our standing humanitarian emergency panel, including for the less well-known crises such as Sudan. Turning now to our commitment on climate justice, Scotland remains committed to addressing the injustice at the heart of climate change, that those who have done the least to cause the crises are suffering the impacts worst and first, and are often the least able to respond. That's becoming ever more evident with some Global South governments' budgets so consumed with responding to the latest climate disaster and on debt relief payments that there's little or nothing left for health and for education. And that's why the Scottish Government established the world's first £36 million Climate Justice Fund, with a specific focus on supporting the most marginalised communities around the world to address the impacts of climate change. And that support extends to the very producers we're discussing today. For example, the Climate Justice Fund Water Futures programme in Malawi worked with UK retailers to ensure water sustainability for communities in Malawi to protect their key exports, namely tea and coffee. And it's in recognition of these challenges faced by our partners that we remain committed to growing the International Development Fund to £15 million by the end of this Parliament and to maintaining a £1 million humanitarian emergency fund. Scotland also faces its own challenges, of course, and we cannot shy away from the fact that there are increasing pressures on public finances here. However, our international development funding reflects our commitment to support and align with the Sustainable Development Goals domestically in Scotland and contributing overseas as a good global citizen. We've been clear that we do not want to balance the books on the backs of the poor. Today's debate on Scotland's renewed fair trade nation status serves as an important reminder that we live in a world facing immense challenges, and we need to work together to ensure that our planet is more equal, fair and sustainable for everyone. Promoting fair trade does just that. Therefore, pleased to move the motion and ask members across the chamber to support it today. Thank you very much, Presiding Officer.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. And I now call on Murdo Fraser to speak to and to move Amendment 16923.1. Around 9 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I very much welcome the opportunity this afternoon to debate the topic of Scotland as a fair trade nation. And in the course of my remarks, I will talk about the progress we have made in terms of the purchase of fair trade products internationally. But I also want to spend a little bit of time looking at what's happening within Scotland in relation to giving a fair deal to producers here. Scotland, as the Cabinet Secretary has already said, is a fair trade nation. And on the 10th of March this year, Scottish Fair Trade announced we had retained our status, stating that all 5 criteria requiring us to be a fair trade nation had been met. However, Scottish Fair Trade made a series of 8 recommendations in relation to keeping the fair trade movement going, including the need to improve data and legislation, connecting with supermarkets and working with the public to keep ethics a high priority. Across Scotland, we know there is considerable consumer support for the concept of fair trade. The latest figures from March last year tell us 85% of Scottish consumers say they buy a fair trade product at least once a year, with 66%, 2/3, saying they buy one at least once a month. And despite the issues with the rising cost of living, there is little evidence that these figures are going into decline, recognising that even when economic times are tough, people are still recognising the value of fair trade. So what is fair trade? Well, essentially it is an arrangement designed to help producers in developing countries achieve sustainable and equitable trade relationships. Those who are part of the fair trade movement can, generally speaking, expect higher prices for their products, which they are then able to pass on to their workers in better pay and benefits, and can also be used to help improve environmental standards. The origins of the fair trade movement were in relation to commodities typically exported from developing countries, such as coffee, cocoa, sugar, fruit, flowers and gold. The Fair Trade Foundation works with farmers and producers and more than 1,900 producer organisations across 68 different countries. In 2023, UK sales of fair trade products generated £28 million in fair trade premiums for farmers and workers, this being money over and above the cash they would have otherwise received for their products. A number of years ago, I had the privilege of visiting Malawi as part of a parliamentary visit with a number of other parliamentary colleagues, and we saw for ourselves at a coffee plantation the value that fair trade brought to the workers there, allowing them to enjoy a level of income and job security that otherwise simply would not have been possible. Public agencies here can lead by example in relation to the purchase of fair trade products. Here in the Scottish Parliament, the SPCB have been very clear that fair trade products should be used wherever possible. But ultimately, fair trade is driven by the consumer. If individuals recognise the value of the fair trade label and understand the benefits it brings, they can choose to use their spending power to support the initiative, even when it might cost them just a little bit extra. And as I highlighted earlier, the evidence shows us that Scottish consumers are prepared to continue to support the Fair Trade programme, even though it might mean them having to pay a small amount extra to do so. It's been good to see so many local communities across Scotland embracing the concept of fair trade. In my own region, Aberfeldy became the first fair trade town in Scotland in 2002, and Kinrossshire became the first fair trade county in Scotland in August 2005. These were both communities where active people came together to push for this label to be adopted. And I'm sure other members will have similar stories of communities in the areas they represent, which have similarly embraced the concept of fair trade. Now, although the focus of the fair trade movement is in relation to international imports of commodities such as coffee, we should not lose sight of the wider concept of fair trade for producers at home, which is a topic mentioned in my amendment this afternoon. It is a consistent and regular complaint we hear from farmers and food producers in Scotland that we do not see sufficient focus on the purchase of locally produced food. This not only supports local employment, it also helps the environment by reducing food miles. And yet too often we see supermarket shelves lined with fruit and vegetables which may well have flown thousands of miles to get here, where there are alternatives available which could be purchased closer to home. And this frustration is particularly felt when it comes to public procurement. Over the years, I can recall many occasions when, in this chamber, we've had debates about the need for procurement rules to better support local economies and local producers. And that's particularly the case when it comes to the provision of food, such as school meals or catering in hospitals, where there is an opportunity to purchase what is produced locally, putting money back into the economy. And too often in the past, we've had NHS boards and local councils hiding behind Scottish Government procurement rules to say that preference cannot be given to local producers. And similarly, the Scottish Government themselves have hidden behind EU procurement rules. But now we are no longer in the EU, these excuses carry little weight. When this Parliament's Economy and Fair Work Committee took evidence recently in relation to post-legislative scrutiny of the Procurement Act, we did hear some examples of good practice where local authorities are making the effort to provide healthy, nutritious meals produced from local ingredients. And that is very much to be welcomed. I was very encouraged to see recently, in fact, our Gyle and Butte Council providing venison on the school menu to support the local industry and local gamekeepers, an initiative I'd like to see rolled out more broadly. But this practice is not universally reflected, and we need to see leadership from the Scottish Government to ensure we are providing fairness for the very substantial public sector spend that we have in supporting local business. Now, there is a legislative opportunity coming up to help address some of these issues, with the introduction just last week of the new Community Wealth Building Scotland Bill, which I had the pleasure of reading over the weekend. The intention of this is to ensure greater support for local economic operators to access public sector contracts and use public procurement to facilitate the generation, circulation and retention of wealth in the local economy. And that all sounds very welcome. But my initial reading of the bill leaves me with a whole list of questions, as to which I will be raising as the bill progresses through its committee stage. Essentially, what the bill requires ministers to do is publish a community wealth building statement. And there are similar obligations on local authorities and the relevant public bodies, including health boards, colleges and enterprise agencies, to work together as community wealth-building partnerships. It all sounds very heavy on strategy and on the publication of documents and rather light on outcomes. And it would be a pity, therefore, if this bill was not a significant opportunity to try and address the concerns that have been raised with us over many years by local businesses about the difficulty they have accessing a fair share of public contracts. Now, that's an issue I'm sure we can pursue in the Economy and Fair Work Committee and indeed in the Chamber as the bill progresses. Presiding Officer, my amendment today also makes a wider point about the benefits of free trade more generally. We have a new US President threatening trade tariffs, which may or may not end up hurting UK exports. And we should be unequivocal about championing free trade. Trade barriers hurt growth and cost jobs. And let us be clear, therefore, that free trade is a positive. And let us encourage the UK Government in particular to look for new trade deals across the world for countries, for example, like India, which will help Scottish and British businesses to grow. So, Presiding Officer, I'm very happy to put on the record our continuing support as a party for the concept of fair trade and join with the Cabinet Secretary in celebrating Scotland's position as a fair trade nation, and I'm pleased to move the amendment in my name. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Fraser. And I now call on Colin Smith to speak to and to move Amendment 16923.2. Around 7 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Scotland's status as a fair trade nation reflects a commitment to social justice, to sustainability, to global solidarity. It's a powerful statement of our shared values, demonstrating leadership and promoting ethical trade and equality at a time that equality too often runs through our global supply chains. As convener of the Parliament's cross-party group on fair trade and chairperson of Dumfries and Galloway Regional Fair Trade Steering Group, I see every day the difference made by that fair trade principle that producers and workers should receive fair payment, good working conditions and opportunities for economic empowerment. And I recognise that it's the work of local groups and campaigners, businesses, faith groups, councils and ultimately the producers themselves that make that fair trade principle a reality. I'm delighted to welcome some of those grassroots campaigners joining us in the gallery today for this debate, as well as those I know are watching online. Like many colleagues, I regularly get to meet those inspiring fair trade campaigners at events across my region. In the last few weeks alone, I've spoken at Dumfries Fair Trade Group's public meeting on the future of fair trade. I've eaten way too many cakes at Kirkcudbright Fair Trade Group's Big Brew and Dunsker's Fair Trade Village Big Brew. A village, Presiding Officer, I have to say, probably organises more fair trade events per head of population than anywhere in the world. Whenever I head to these events, my kids always shout, "Don't forget the fair trade chocolate," usually followed by my wife saying, "and the fair trade wine." Let's hope she doesn't find out there's also fair trade gold now too. But it's that recognition, that warmth, that support for fair trade that's been generated by the work of our fair trade communities. So I want to say a heartfelt thank you to every volunteer, every shop, every organisation, every school, every faith group that plays such an important role in delivering trade justice for vulnerable farmers and workers in the Global South. Their efforts, along with ours in Parliament, are supported by the fantastic work of Scottish Fair Trade, previously under the leadership of Martin Rhodes and now Louise Davis, alongside our small but exceptional team, Catherine, Cisa and Ciara, backed by their board under the chairmanship of Charles, Liz and Rachel. It was the work of Scottish Fair Trade that led to the step change in fair trade activity in Scotland that's resulted in fair trade nation status being secured more than a decade ago. And now we celebrate the fact that has been renewed this year, at a time that those fair trade principles of fair prices, decent working conditions, local sustainability and fair terms of trade for farmers and workers have never been more important than they are now. Fair trade challenges the injustices of conventional trade and is at the heart of the fight against climate change. That fair trade premium, by ensuring producers in the Global South are paid fairly, is a lifeline for communities, allowing them to invest in sustainable farming and afford medicine, education, food and good housing. I'm happy to give way.
John Mason.
I thank the member very much for giving way. He's mentioned a lot of good news, and I certainly support that and welcome that. But he's also mentioned a lot about food. And would you accept that we've still got some way to go as far as clothing is concerned? And we have heard at the cross-party group that it's been difficult to get procurement for clothing.
Colin Smith.
I agree entirely with the really important point that John Mason makes. And I'm going to come to the importance of procurement in a second, because if the question is, can we do a lot more as a parliament and as a government, then the answer is absolutely yes, we certainly can. I mean, just ask any local fair trade group who tried to get a fair trade sign at the entrance of their fair trade village or town, and the Council or Transport Scotland say no. Or ask how much of Scotland's £16 billion of public sector procurement budget is actually spent on fair trade products. And the answer often is, we simply do not know. Scottish Fair Trade has been trying to measure this since 2019, yet there is no consistent monitoring or definition. The Economy and Fair Work Committee's inquiry into the Procurement Reform Act last year highlighted the lack of a standardised legal definition of fairly traded, leading to different interpretations by different bodies. We need a clearer definition aligned with Fair Trade International and the World Fair Trade Organisation, not to mandate purchases of fair trade, but to enhance transparency and accountability. Since our committee's recommendation, I am pleased that guidance on procurement is improvement, but I would urge the Government to go further by enshrining this definition in law through an amendment to the Procurement Reform Act. Then we can really see just how much fair trade products are bought. Scottish business also have a vital role to play. As a Labour and cooperative MSP, I am proud of the cooperative movement's early and continued support for fair trade. The co-op retail movement remains fair trade's largest UK supporter, and of course many fair trade producers operate as cooperatives. Other retailers could really follow this example by increasing the fair trade stock that they sell and ensuring ethical supply chains. By integrating ethical risk assessments and supply chain due diligence, Scotland could lead the way when it comes to responsible trade. Now, given that fair trade enterprises also face higher costs than conventional businesses, we should also strengthen support to help them thrive and scale up their impact. And, Presiding Officer, just as it's vital to embed fair trade and ethical supply chains in Scottish business practices, it's vital to integrate fair trade in education and lifelong learning to inspire the next generation's commitment to fair and ethical trade. I'm delighted that we are joined by some of those future champions from Holy Cross High School in Hamilton in the gallery today. They really do lead by example in their work. Presiding Officer, Fair Trade Nation status is more than a title. It's a commitment to social justice, to sustainability and to global solidarity. It strengthens our international reputation and affirms our leadership in ethical trade. But to maintain this status, we must and we can do more, ensuring public procurement policies align with fair trade principles and embedding those values in business and in education. Fair trade is not just about purchasing choices, it's about the world we want to build, one rooted in fairness and equity and sustainability. So I'm pleased to move Labour's amendment in my name and to support the Government's motion. And there are areas within the Conservative amendment that I may not fully agree with, but I do recognise the important points made about the support for local producers, which isn't in conflict to fair trade, I would stress, as well as the recognition that fair trade businesses are often the most entrepreneurial, given the barriers they face. It's important we speak as one voice today in this Parliament, and we work together across parties and across sectors to ensure that Scotland continues to lead as a fair trade nation, and by doing so we will make a lasting difference for communities that need fair trade today more than they ever have.
Thank you, Mr Smith. And I now call on Patrick Harvey to open on behalf of the Scottish Greens. Around 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm very happy to have the chance to do so, to speak in this debate, which has already heard a few examples, and my guess is we're going to hear a fair number more examples of people's local organisations in every corner of the country, because the fair trade movement is there in every community across the country. And I'd like to echo Colin Smith's comments in welcoming the fact that both the current and the next generation of representatives of the fair trade movement are with us here in Parliament today and watching at home. In my own region in Glasgow, one of the most familiar names both to those who seek out fair trade products and to the kind of businesses that want to put fair trade products on their shelves, is Green City Whole Foods, a long-standing wholesaler that's done a huge amount to improve the recognition level and the accessibility of fair trade products. But there are also newer businesses, for example, some of the coffee roasters, the chocolatiers around the country, who may not necessarily have the fair trade logo or may not necessarily have it yet on their products, but they are making significant efforts. They're going above and beyond the bare minimum of what their business requires in order to find ways to trade fairly and to ensure and also to communicate the benefit to producers around the world that they have links with. The work of a wide range of those kind of businesses and great many campaigners, voluntary organisations and others has been going on for, as other members have said, a great deal of time, and that's why we see some of these very positive statistics in the briefing papers about the high level of recognition, the number of people in Scotland who do regularly buy fair trade products, and the number of community organisations and local authorities that have fair trade as part of their procurement. But I think it's really important that we don't relegate this issue and consign it to the category of voluntary good works, because I think the fair trade movement is intended to achieve much more than that. It's intended as a provocation. In fact, I think Colin Smith said it was there to challenge the unfairness of conventional trade. The fair trade movement is there to ask for and demand and to achieve change. Change in the way that the whole global trading system works. And that change is absolutely needed. So I want to welcome the positive work that the Scottish Government has done on fair trade, such as it is. But when I went looking the other day for a little bit of prep on this debate, I assumed that I would go to the trade pages on the Scottish Government website for some information about that. It's absent from those pages. I looked at the document, A Trading Nation, which sets out the Scottish Government's approach to trade policy. Fair trade is absent entirely from that document. And I don't single out the Scottish Government. I think this is true of the UK Government and a great many other governments around the world who want to be seen to do the right thing when it comes to supporting voluntarism in relation to fair trade, but they don't join the dots and they don't embed the principles of fair trade in trade policy itself. There's a disjoint. As fair trade is seen as something positive, but basically an optional policy area, separate from trade policy. There is scope, a great deal of scope, to take a much more expansive view of fair trade, bringing in a wider ethical approach. For example, as some businesses do, dealing with the issues that arise from trading in conflict zones and areas of occupation. A number of fair trade businesses go out of their way to give space and profile and priority, for example, to Palestinian products and positively avoid stocking products that are produced by those who benefit from the illegal occupation of Palestine. That kind of wider understanding of fair trade needs to go further. There's nothing at all in the government motion or the Labour amendment that I disagree with, and I'll certainly support those. But I have to say that the Conservative amendment is unsupportable, and I would be disappointed if the Government and the Labour Party supported it as well. The idea that free and fair trade are part of the same sentence entirely ignores the fact that these concepts are, at the very least, in tension with each other. I would regard them as in conflict with each other, but at the very least, they are in tension with each other. The idea that trade liberalisation is central to fair trade must come from the head of someone who'd never heard of the concept of structural adjustment. Far too often in the history of trade policy around the world, it has been the wealthy and the powerful who have imposed trade liberalisation on the poor and developing countries, particularly in the global south, while happily using protectionism to look after their own industries at home. There has been a great deal of hypocrisy from powerful countries using free trade as an economic weapon to impose on others while protecting themselves from the harmful effects of it. There's no attempt, I think, for example, to structurally adjust the powerful countries themselves when we know that the way they trade is fundamental to activities that undermine progress to the IDGs or undermine progress toward net zero. And now, in the context of Trump's trade wars, based on the absurd idea that wherever a trade imbalance exists, the country with a surplus is doing something abusive or unacceptable to the country with a trade deficit. Essentially, that selling things that other people want to buy is inherently unfair trade. And at the same time, international aid, as the Cabinet Secretary mentioned, is being slashed, not just by the US government, but by the UK and others. And I think when those appalling cuts to UK aid were announced, the Conservatives, far from opposing it, said those cuts weren't deep enough. The fair trade movement will be less able to achieve the things that it has achieved in recent decades in the context of the decimation of international aid and by the idea that powerful countries like the US are simply going to dictate terms to the rest of us. Some countries are standing up to this nonsense, while others, including the UK, appear to be preparing to capitulate to powerful countries like the US. Fair trade, Presiding Officer, should not be seen merely as a voluntary concession toward producers in a minority of developing countries. If we accept that the global trading system is too often unfair and that this is harmful, we should be seeking to achieve systemic changes which always protect the poorest and most vulnerable from exploitation by wealthy countries, big business and powerful governments. So, Presiding Officer, I regret that we won't be able to unite on an amended motion if the Conservative amendment passes tonight. I hope we are united on the value of fair trade, but we are clearly not united on the idea that it is compatible with the deregulated, race-to-the-bottom, free market economy that we live in today.
Thank you, Mr Harvey. And I now call on Willie Rennie. Sorry, can I just say to our guests in the gallery who are most welcome here that actually we don't really do applause in the gallery because it's the elected members who are the participants in the proceedings. But, of course, our guests are so very welcome to listen to our proceedings. And with that, I call Willie Rennie to open on behalf of the Scottish Liberal Democrats. Around 6 minutes, please. I'm glad, Deputy Presiding Officer, you warned them before my speech, because I'm sure there would have been rapturous applause from across the gallery after they've heard my rousing speech. There we go. I want to actually just remark that there's elements of my speech that are remarkably similar to Patrick Harvey, which causes me great anxiety this afternoon. But he says sound judgment. Let's see. But the joining the dots bit, the kind of the silo mentality that I think does exist, is actually a fair point, because the intervention that I made on the Minister about the Chinese-produced solar panels, which the claim is that Uyghur Muslims are actually being used as slave labour to produce these solar panels, which we're using for our efforts to try and tackle climate change in this country, is a real conflict. Because there are very few countries in the world that actually produce solar panels. China is one of the main producers. But there is a real moral conflict that's facing us with that. And it's too often the case that we do parcel off the fair trade movement into a corner and we don't think about the wider consequences of our main business. Would you give way? Certainly. Patrick Harvey. I'm grateful to Willie Rennie for taking the intervention. Would he agree that the solar panel example that he gives is a good argument for why the systemic change approach is what's required? Because there's no way that the Scottish Government or any other government could simply take over something like solar panel procurement and buy that on behalf of everybody. That would massively reduce the choice of people being able to install the right kit in the right place. So what we need is to prevent those unfairly traded products getting onto the market in the first place, and consumer choice can't do that alone. It needs government action. Willie Rennie.
On those scale of products, of course it needs government action. It needs a bigger system approach. It needs to have a global recognition of where the challenges are and a global understanding, because there's no way that the Scottish Government, I would imagine, could investigate the supply chain in China all the way down to the nth degree. But there should at least be a due diligence process, which has been severely lacking in many cases, which some members will recall the whole issue of the China Railway Company No. 3 that had relations to human rights abuses in Africa, and they had offered through a subsidiary in the United Kingdom a £10 billion deal to the Scottish Government to invest in infrastructure here. But there wasn't even a proper due diligence process involved in that, and I would have hoped that perhaps the Government would be consistent across its fair trade policies through its procurement in order to make sure we can try and tackle some of these deep-rooted problems. And of course, we're going through the process just now of investing significantly in the ScotWind round of offshore wind farms. And many Chinese companies are interested in that work. And I would hope there would be some kind of process to check the supply chain for those. So I think there are some challenges, and I think there does need to be a global effort to make sure we understand those challenges. But I'm afraid the silo mentality that exists just now is just not adequate. But I do want to begin, I suppose, by paying credit to the many organisations across the country that have engaged over many, many years in fair trade and their contribution to making Scotland a fair trade nation, from councils to companies to communities to the public sector, all parts of the country. I have to say the weaknesses that the report has identified are, I think, quite sharp, because John Mason's point about it has to be quite a low threshold before you can pass the test. I think we need to make sure that we are actually fully engaging across the country if we can truly say that we are a fair trade nation. There's a small number of schools that are engaged in this. The NHS, I think it comes in for particular criticism within the report, although they've got a programme. Is there proper engagement in the process? I think is a big question. It's a low bar for the local authorities to be involved. So let's challenge ourselves to be much better rather than just accepting that we've passed the test. But I want to pay particular tribute to St Andrews, that celebrates 20 years of being a fair trade town, and the campaign that's been involved there has been very effective in not just making sure that there is a range of products that you can buy within St Andrews, but there is also good education for the local community to understand the challenges that we face in this area. And so effective has their campaign been that the University of St Andrews is now a fair trade university, which is all very positive. But I think Murdo Fraser's point about free trade, yes, free trade is good. I'm a Liberal. I would, of course, say free trade is a good thing. But unfettered free trade is not a good thing. We need to have elements of control. It needs to have a moral compass. We need to make sure that we are actually purchasing in a controlled way rather than an unfettered way. So yes, I think it can drive improvements in many countries, and it can create opportunities, growth and jobs. But it can equally, if not used in the proper hands, be used as a weapon, which is my second point of agreement with Patrick Harvey. Because President Trump is using trade as a weapon. And he's using trade as a weapon not for the good of the globe, but for the good of his supporters and his supporters in the United States. And that is not something that we should be supporting, and we should recognise when trade is being used in those terms. So finally, I just want to praise all those who have made sure that Scotland again is a fair trade nation. There is so much more work to be done, though. We should not rest on our laurels. We should make sure that everybody understands the benefit of fair trade, but the government needs to make sure that every corner of government activity endorses those principles as well.
Thank you, Mr Rennie. We will now move to the open debate, backbench speeches of up to 6 minutes, and I call George Adam to be followed by Alexander Stewart. Mr Adam.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Presiding Officer, it's a privilege to speak in this debate on Scotland's status as a fair trade nation, an achievement that represents our unwavering commitment to fairness, social justice and global solidarity. As we all know, Scotland first became a fair trade nation in 2013, and today we reaffirm that commitment. But let's be clear, this status is not just a title, it's a reflection of our values and a promise to do the right to those across the world who produce the goods we rely on. Presiding Officer, I can tell you for me that this is more than just a policy discussion. It's a journey that started all those years ago in the heart of the centre of the universe, if you wish, in Paisley. All roads, as you know, Presiding Officer, lead to the great town of Paisley. And many years ago, it was the vision and commitment and determination of Provost John McDowell, a proud Paisley bloody, a Labour man and a St Mirren supporter. As Meatloaf said, Presiding Officer, 2 out of 3 ain't bad. But he set us in the path to making Paisley a fair trade town, and he recognised that if we wanted to call ourselves a community that values fairness and justice, we had to lead by example. Under his leadership, businesses, schools and local groups came together to back fair trade principles, ensuring that Paisley took its rightful place in the global movement for trade justice. But this isn't just about campaign and meetings and certificates, it's also about action on the ground. And a shining example of this in Paisley is Rainbow Turtle, Paisley's own fair trade shop. For over 2 decades, Rainbow Turtle have been a cornerstone of our town's retail landscape, offering fair trade goods and educating the public about ethical trade. This shop is not just a place to buy fairly sourced coffee or crafts. It is a symbol of Paisley's commitment to doing business the right way. It has endured when many in the high street names have come and gone, showing that ethical retail can thrive and support within our community. As a Renfrewshire councillor, I was proud to take that mission further. We worked to ensure that Renfrewshire became a fair trade county because, Presiding Officer, why stop at just one town when the entire region can actually follow as well. And we engaged with local businesses, school and faith groups to embed fair trade into everyday decisions. That was more than just selling fair trade tea and coffee. It was about making ethical choices as a core part of how we operate as a community. And then when I came to this place, I was the chair of the cross-party group in Fair Trade and had the honour of being at the heart of Scotland's national effort to secure Fair Trade Nation the first time. I saw first-hand the dedication of campaigners, businesses and community groups who worked tirelessly to achieve that goal. And now, more than a decade later, we continue to lead this way. So basically, Presiding Officer, saying it was me what done it, I was involved in absolutely everything. But I'm only joking. It's not just about me. It's about everyone else that gets involved in the campaign. Presiding Officer, but we cannot take this for granted. The world has changed, and so have the challenges we face. Climate change, economic instability and deepening global inequalities all make fair trade more important than it's ever been. That's why Scotland must continue to be a leader, not just in words, but in actions. The Scottish Government has shown its commitment through initiatives like the Climate Justice Fund, ensuring that those in the Global South who are the least responsible for climate change are not the ones paying the highest price. But we must go further. We must strengthen fair trade supply chains, support businesses that choose ethical sourcing and empower consumers to make informed choices. And that brings me to one of the areas where I think there can be a massive difference made in sporting goods and sportswear. Effectively, it's a massive market, but for years the main manufacturers have been criticised by how they go about getting their goods to market, and where it be the slave almost the wages of those in certain parts of the world, and also how they make sure that the third-party suppliers actually have an ethical background as well. Now, work has been done, but this is a massive market that people generally outside of here would probably engage with on a regular basis, and that's down to our football clubs, sporting clubs, to make sure that they lead the way as well, because I think this is an important issue that we need to take further as well. But let's not forget the wider context. At a time when the UK Government has chosen to cut international aid, Scotland is showing a different path, a path that we stand with producers in Malawi, Rwanda and beyond, a path where we recognise that fairness in trade is not just about economics, but about dignity, human rights and a better future. Presiding Officer, let's be clear. Scotland's status as a fair trade nation is not a trophy to be admired from afar. It's a challenge to keep. It's a challenge to keep pushing, keep improving and keep making trade work for people, not just for profit. And much of what has been said during today's debate has shown the way for us to do that, has shown that we must work together to do that. But I still bring it back to there are key parts of markets that we should be looking at, and sporting goods in particular are one where we should be looking at maybe ways of organisations like local authorities who may have sporting leisure facilities actually look at kitting out those that work for them in more ethical equipment, because at the end of the day It's okay for us to talk about this here, but we have to lead by example. And that in itself is a multi-billion-pound market. And I can guarantee you the major two German manufacturers never produce in Germany anymore, and the major American manufacturer currently don't produce in America, yet it's all done very cheaply and sold for massive profit. And they have to give something back to the people who are producing their goods. So as someone who has seen the impact of fair trade both locally and in Scotland in itself, from Rainbow Turtle and Paisley to here in the Parliament, I know we can meet this challenge, and I know that Scotland will continue to become a beacon of fairness and justice in a world that desperately needs both.
Thank you. I now call Alexander Stewart to be followed by Karen Adam. Up to 6 minutes. Mr Stewart.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm pleased to contribute this afternoon's debate on behalf of the Scottish Conservatives, and I'll be supporting the amendment in the name of Murdo Fraser. These benches strongly welcome the recent news that Scotland has retained its status as a fair trade nation. This reflects Scotland's national commitment to the ethical trade across the globe as we work towards an economy that is fair for everyone. Fair trade is not only a concept that is welcomed across this chamber, but it is widespread and has received much public support. Data from the recent Fair Trade report confirms that 97% of Scots are aware of fair trade as a concept, 85% purchase fair trade at least once a year, 66% purchase once a month, and nearly 70% of local councils arrange and agree to fair trade. Now, these are very strong commitments that we have, and that is vitally important. Surely.
Mason.
Thank you, Member, for giving way. I mean, on the point of if somebody buys something once a year, I mean, buying one coffee in this Parliament would count. That's not a very high bar, is it?
Alexander Stewart, and give you the time.
I thank John Mason for that. But if everybody buys one coffee, it's a start, Mr Mason. And I think that the public do understand, and as I've said before, we go to various events, we have the facility to use it, and if people do take it, as I say, it's a start in the right direction. Over the last couple of decades, fair trade practices have become ingrained within communities across the country. Last year, within my own region of Mid-Scotland and Fife, we saw Fair Trade Stirling held their 20th anniversary event. So for 20 years they have been supporting that, and the work of the group combined with the efforts of Stirling Council led to the city receiving trade status back in 2004. And as part of the trade group across Scotland, Fair Trade Stirling has taken part in many important projects that promote and facilitate fair practices around the world. And these are to be commended and congratulated. This includes setting up the Stirling Skills Centre in Malawi nearly 15 years ago, which helps young people develop the skills they need to find work. Indeed, as a country, Malawi is a shining example of the potential benefits of work being done within the fair trade. And, as you know, Presiding Officer, yourself and myself are co-conveners of the cross-party group on Malawi, and we see on a regular basis the outstanding work that Malawi is doing when it comes to fair trade. The Scottish Fair Trade Forum has done so much to deal with that and to launch that, and that was launched back in 2007. And also back in 2018, I was pleased to be able to sign the International Fair Trade Charter, where Scottish Fair Trade hosted that important agreement here. The Charter promises to use the vision and experiences of over 250 organisations from around the globe that help reshape businesses and trade around the world. This remains a principle, and I'm happy to support that still today. While we are proud to move forward, and a lot of work has been done, as you already heard, much more needs to be done to ensure that Scotland and the United Kingdom is seen as a world leader when it comes to this issue. Scottish Fair Trade's reports highlight the enormous effort that will be needed in order to keep fair trade movement going forward, so it continues to have that enhancement. This includes enhancing public awareness. We need to make sure that more people are aware of that. We need to ensure that there are embedding, and we're embedding within the importance of fair trade across Scotland Scotland. And we've touched on that this afternoon about the education system. Many local education authorities are already taking forward steps to ensure that schools take part in the Fair Trade Fortnight every year, and that they do attempt to purchase and be involved in fair trade products. However, it's important that the Scottish Government looks at opportunities for fair trade principles to become very commonplace within Scotland. And that's been touched on again this afternoon about what we need to do to ensure that we do more to achieve that. And one of the long-standing criteria is that we want to widen and see that fairness across the trades. So within the fair trade movement and the high level of importance that we have, we need to ensure that the next generation and the younger generations are actively aware of what is happening within their areas. Presiding Officer, while it's important that we speak up fair trade practices, it's also important, as we've heard from Murdo Fraser, that we highlight local and homegrown processes. Across Scotland, we have great examples of councils ensuring that local good food producers are fully utilised, and that reduces transport costs and helps to protect local jobs. It's important that the standard practice that we see is there within Scotland, and that opens opportunities. Leadership from the Scottish Government, we've already heard, has been in this involvement, and much more needs to be done. Our amendment speaks about the free trade area being an effective way to reduce global poverty and increase global prosperity, and that's what we want to see. Given the current global climate and the situations we find, it's already been discussed in the Chamber this afternoon, we want to highlight things and opportunities that are out there, but it's a changing world, and we need to be alive to that. So in conclusion, Presiding Officer, fair trade is less about what we buy as consumers and more about who we are as a nation. I hope today's debate has given us an opportunity to highlight that, because our amendment is clear that these benches are committed to the principles, because fair trade is good for communities, it's good for individuals, it's good for the supply chain, and it's good for our nation. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you, Mr Stewart. I now call Karen Adam to be followed by Faisal Chowdhury. Up to 6 minutes, Ms Adam.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And I want to join my colleagues in welcoming Scotland's renewed status as a fair trade nation. This is not merely a badge of honour, it is a reaffirmation of who we are and the values we choose to stand for: fairness, dignity, solidarity and justice. And I want to begin by paying tribute to the fair trade campaigners, businesses and community groups across our country whose dedication has made this possible. Among them are the inspiring members of the Peterhead and Buchan Fair Trade Group. They are from my own constituency of Banffshire and Buchan Coast. This collective, made up of volunteers from Peterhead, but also my colleague's constituency, Gillian Martin, in Mintlaw and New Deer. And they have worked tirelessly since achieving fair trade status in 2012, a status they've proudly renewed again just this year. The group's work reaches across our communities and into the hearts of our schools. They have held fundraising stalls at school fairs, presented to assemblies and even introduced fair trade cotton uniforms as an option in local schools, planting the seeds of global citizenship in the minds of our young people. Now that's what's important. They show us that fair trade is not a distant ideal, but something woven into our everyday lives, our choices, our shops and our classrooms. The Peterhead and Buchan Fair Trade Group have also worked with local businesses, organising permanent fair trade displays in hardware stores and running seasonal sales and raffles to raise awareness. They've partnered with the Co-op, collaborated with Aberdeen City Fair Trade, presented to local organisations like the Mintlaw Women's Institute and the Central Buchan Rotary, and participated in national and international forums like Meet the Producer and Campaigning Together. Their current campaign deserves special mention, collecting and sending donated tools like drills, grinders and sewing machines to a rice cooperative in Malawi. It's an initiative that speaks not only to the creativity of local campaigners, but to the deep solidarity at the heart of the fair trade movement. Presiding Officer, Scotland has been a fair trade nation since 2013. Retaining this status again in 2025 reaffirms our ongoing commitment to fairness, social justice and global solidarity. And it's a reminder that our small nation can make a big difference on the world stage, especially when we stand shoulder to shoulder with producers and workers in the global south. We live in a world racked by enormous challenges: climate change, conflict, inequality and global health crisis. These crises disproportionately affect the very communities that fair trade seeks to support. And Scotland's response has been clear. We choose to stand in solidarity. We choose partnership over exploitation, and we choose justice over indifference. The fair trade model is about more than just trade. It recognises the rights, dignity and livelihoods of those throughout the supply chain, empowering farmers, workers and producers to build better lives for themselves and their communities. And this is at the heart of the Scottish Government's international strategy through initiatives like the Climate Justice Fund, launched in 2012, making Scotland the first country to commit funds explicitly to climate justice. And through our partnerships with countries such as Malawi, Zambia, Rwanda and Pakistan, we continue to promote inclusive development and ethical global relationships. Scotland's International Development Fund will increase to £12.8 million in 25-26, and this includes support for humanitarian emergencies and vital investment in areas such as global health and education, especially for marginalised women and girls. At a time when global need is rising, this government's commitment is both morally right and strategically wise. In stark contrast, unfortunately, the UK Labour Government has chosen to slash international aid to just 0.3% of gross national income, breaking a manifesto promise and turning its back on some of the world's poorest communities. Scotland chooses another path. We choose to lead, and I believe deeply that with the powers of independence we could go even further, committing to the UN's target of 0.7% for official development assistance and enshrining that promise in law. But until that day comes, let us make every devolved lever count. Through our vision for trade, we apply the principles of inclusive growth, well-being, sustainability, net zero and good governance to every decision we make, placing fairness and the planet at the heart of our economy. And through grassroots efforts like those by the Peterhead and Buchan Fair Trade Group, fair trade lives and breathes in our communities. Groups like Peterhead and Buchan remind us that global solidarity starts at home, that a stall in a school hall, a cotton uniform, a donated sewing machine, these are all acts of hope. Presiding Officer, Scotland's status as a fair trade nation is not a static accolade. It is a living and evolving commitment. It asks something of each of us, to advocate, to educate and to choose differently, to build a system that serves not just the fortunate but the forgotten. And let us continue to uphold that commitment. Let us honour the campaigners, the producers and the promise that Scotland can be a beacon of fairness in a world that desperately needs it. Thank you.
Thank you. I now call Faisal Chowdhury to be followed by Christine Graham. Up to 6 minutes. Mr Chowdhury.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I would first like to join members in welcoming the continued recognition of Scotland as a fair trade nation. It is not only a testament to the work of campaigners and businesses that promote and stock fair trade goods, but to Scotland's role as an outward-looking global nation. It was the Scottish Labour Government that kick-started the process for Scotland to be recognised as a fair trade nation in 2007. But the history of the movement goes far beyond that. The modern fair trade movement is said to have started after World War II with an American woman called Edwina Ruth Byler. She would buy laces products from women in Puerto Rico for a truly fair price and sell them to her friends. She said, "I'm just a woman trying to help other women." These simple principles of support, fairness and trade justice remain until this day. Since then, the movement has grown massively, with the UK's own fair trade certification turning 31 this year, generating millions in premiums for producers, improving their lives and building their communities. Edinburgh too has played a role in the fair trade movement. On George Street, in the centre of the city, sits Hadil, a fair trade shop selling Palestinian goods, providing a source of income for artisans and farmers. The University of Edinburgh is one of Scotland's 3 universities with fair trade status. Edinburgh itself gained a Fair Trade City status in 2004. Edinburgh Fair Trade City Steering Group organises events making Fair Trade Fortnight like Fair Trade Festival and display in Edinburgh's library. This commitment has led to Edinburgh's hosting the International Fair Trade Towns Conference this August, bringing producers and campaigners from across the world to discuss the benefits of fair trade and how can we use fair trade to meet the Sustainable Development Goals. I've heard firsthand the impact of fair trade with the cross-party group on Bangladesh. We heard from a representative of Community Crafts, a fair trade organisation which has operated for more than 40 years, giving marginalised women the opportunity to make a fair wage, creating products from upcycled saris that are sold right here in Edinburgh at One World Shop, which I visited last year, and has sold only fair trade goods for more than 40 years. In fact, the representative from the Community Crafts was in Scotland to find more buyers for their goods. This shows the strength of feeling towards fair trade here in Scotland. And its powerful global effects. However, with the continued prevalence of poor working practices and exploitation in the clothes we wear or the technology we use every day, there is still much more can achieve. Fair trade in Bangladesh especially can be powerful forces for achieving climate justice. Producers in the Global South can be considered to have done the least to cause the climate crisis, but face the greatest loss as climate change. For a multinational corporation, changing climate may mean a loss on the balance sheet. But for a small-scale farmer, it means losing their livelihood. With fair trade, producers are better able to adopt and protect their livelihood and communities. I note the story of Colombian coffee cooperative Red Echo Sierra, who through fair trade were able to invest in sustainable growing practice like shade trees and better coffee drying. But we must keep working to maximise the benefit of being a fair trade nation. Colin Smith has already discussed procurement and standard definition. Those are positive steps. We should also be looking to further encourage businesses across all sectors to adopt fair trade practices and supporting them in building sustainable, ethical supply chains. By renewing and strengthening the Scottish Businesses Pledge, I would welcome any further work to embed and encourage the principles of fair trade in all across our economy. The strength of the fair trade movement in Scotland is something we should be proud of. While much of the world seems to be turning in, with fair trade, we can make a positive case for cooperation and friendship. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Chowdhury. I now call Christine Graham to be followed by John Mason, up to 6 minutes. Ms Graham.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. I too applaud Scotland as a fair trade nation. As we know, fair trade means that farmers and other producers in less economically developed countries should receive a fair price for the goods they produce, and when sold in support of these aims usually carry a fair trade label. Everybody practically knows that. 60% of the fair trade market consists of food products such as coffee, tea, cocoa, honey and bananas. It also, however, covers non-food commodities, crafts, textiles and flowers. These three are not so often identified as products which may start their long journey from the fields and sweatshops in countries where labour and sometimes life comes cheap. So much depends on businesses and us. We are at the end of the production chain. from growing to processing to packaging and into our shopping basket. We recognise the labels on bananas and coffee, but what is often missed is the cost to poor countries of supplying garments to UK outlets. The price of fair trade bananas, and indeed coffee, is often on a par with other commercial products. But if a T-shirt is only £2 or a jacket or dress is only £10, you should ask yourself, how is it such a low price? I would add that in these days of inflation and austerity, not everyone has the luxury of answering that through their choices, though perhaps the culture of throwaway fashion has a lot to answer for. From the back-breaking work or exploitation of the poor, within weeks it's in landfill. Neither is good for people or the planet. A few years back, clothing retailers, including the venerable Marks and Spencers, were taken to task for what amounted to child labour, of which, to be frank, they were sometimes very unaware, producing at some stage clothing for their shops. Since an exposé, not just of them but other retailers, M&S have in place a publicly accessible and ethical trading policy. Now several supermarket chains from the UK, including Tesco's and Sainsbury's, have been in talks with the Fair Trade Foundation as they want to join forces to buy fair trade bananas, coffee and cocoa from farmers in developing countries. A UK fair trade coalition would be the first buying coalition of its kind. It would increase the availability of fair trade products to consumers. Now, crucial to this project is approval by the Competition and Markets Authority, the CMA. And the UK's competition watchdog has recently indicated in an informal advice note that it does not expect to take enforcement action as a result of such a scheme, and that joint buying would have neutral or even positive effects on competition by giving shoppers a wider choice of fair trade products. According to Fair Trade, this buying coalition would give supermarkets more power to resolve major issues such as child labour, living wages and deforestation. If the project proceeds and proves successful in the UK, the NGO hopes to expand it to other markets in Europe, including Belgium and the Netherlands, for example. Now, I've yet to discover where the UK is with the initiative, and I'd welcome up-to-date information, as consumer products and their regulation are UK-based, because ultimately, while governments and public agencies, including this Parliament, with large procurement budgets, can exercise choices and promote fair trade, the public have a huge impact on what happens in the fields, forests and factories across the poorer parts of the world. And this may in some way change the balance from when Great Britain exploited large parts of the world and took so much of their natural resources, parts now that are in desperate need of some economic assistance. And fair trade is one way to do it.
Thank you, Ms Graham. I now call John Mason to be followed by Emma Roddick. Up to 6 minutes. Mr Mason.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. Thank you for the opportunity to speak today. And can I just say also thank you to Colin Smith, who leads the Fair Trade Cross-Party Group, which I seek to attend as often as I can. Clearly, we're focused today on fair trade around the world, and especially where the richer West buys goods and services from poorer developing countries. However, the principles should apply across the board, as one or two others have mentioned, and fair trade with a small f and a small t should include farmers being paid a reasonable price for the milk they produce here in Scotland, and workers here being paid properly for the jobs they do. Firstly, I would say that the concept of fair trade is absolutely excellent, and we should surely all support it. We in the richer West should not be maintaining our affluent lifestyles at the expense of workers suffering miserable conditions and paid minimal wages in the developing world or global south. Many of us can easily afford to pay a little extra for coffee or wine, with the assurance that farmers growing the produce are getting a good deal, so that they can work reasonable hours, they can live in decent housing and can afford to send their children to school. And it's encouraging that fair trade products have improved over the years, for example with good quality coffee, such as we get here in Parliament. I do remember the days when fair trade coffee was pretty poor quality. Therefore, I very much congratulate those involved in achieving fair trade nation status for Scotland once again. However, secondly, I would say that we need to go further. It still seems to be quite a narrow range of products which have fair trade varieties available. Yes, there may be almost 5,000 fair trade products for sale in the UK, according to the grocer. However, I still feel it is quite a restricted list. Specifically, I do not think we have made as much progress with clothing as we might have. There is praise in the report that St Andrews University shop, which supplies fair trade sweatshirts and hoodies to students, but clearly this is a lot less common in high street fashion retailers. We did have one CPG meeting where Corpus Christi Primary School from Glasgow told us they had worked with Cool Schools and had sourced and sold fair trade uniforms, so we know it can be done. However, from my memory of that meeting, they had to go through a number of hoops in order to be allowed to do this. My understanding is that the procurement rules and regulations for public bodies like councils do not always sit well with a desire to expand fair trade. And thirdly, I do think the fair trade system needs to be tightened up. It is definitely worthwhile at the moment, but as my staff were doing some research for my speech yesterday, it did raise some questions. For example, some figures look really good on the surface, like 88% of local authorities have schools involved in significant fair trade activity. However, we're then told that only 6.5% of Scottish schools are part of the Fair Trade Schools scheme. So that does not sound quite so good. We have 10 principles of fair trade from the World Fair Trade Organisation, and while all of these are good principles, it does seem to me that some of them are a bit too woolly. No child labour or forced labour is pretty clear-cut, that's good. And while I accept that good working conditions will inevitably vary from country to country, taking into account the local norms and culture. However, other aims like promote fair trade and capacity building do leave a lot to the imagination and a fair bit of wriggle room. I note the recommendations in the report and some of us as MSPs in Parliament to take on board. For example, there should be explicit inclusion of fair trade in legislation, and there should be more prescription for MSP action to implement the Fair Trade Pledge. There is also a point that there should be better ways of measuring what is being implemented at a constituency and local level. Concerning the amendments, I would be in broad agreement with Labour, and especially the point about establishing a standard definition and measurement framework for fair trade in public sector procurement. I have no problem in supporting that. However, not surprisingly, I would have some reservations about the Conservative angle and their amendment, despite it coming from the relatively pleasant Conservative Murdo Fraser. Free trade and fair trade are not the same thing, as I think Patrick Harvey was pointing out earlier. Very briefly, yes.
Bob Doris.
I wonder if the member thinks a clearer definition of relatively pleasant also.
John Mason.
I could go into it more detail. I don't think I've quite got time for that. But free trade and fair trade are not the same thing. And in fact, in some cases, fair trade is the opposite of free trade. Free trade says that the strong extract resources from the weak at the lowest possible price they can get away with. Free trade says that Ukraine must surrender its mineral assets to America in order to get support to be a democracy. Free trade says that children can be sold into slavery in South Asia and elsewhere to save their families from starvation. So, of course, there are good aspects to free trade, especially if the trade is between relative equals. But one of the reasons we need fair trade is because free trade has not worked. And the West has not been good historically at ensuring that free trade is also fair. So overall, I welcome the fact that Scotland has renewed her status as a fair trade nation. However, I do feel that the bar is quite low at present, and we all need to do more as individuals, organisations and as a country if we are serious about it, making trade around the world beneficial to all involved. Thank you.
We now come to the final speaker in the open debate, Emma Roddick. Around 6 minutes, please, Ms Roddick.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm glad to have the opportunity to contribute to this debate this afternoon and proud that Scotland has maintained its fair trade nation status since achieving this in 2013. I know that this topic is incredibly important to many of my constituents, including those involved with Fair Trade Inverness, which is a very visible group, something that makes sense given that Inverness itself achieved Fair Trade City status in 2008 and has also maintained it ever since, not to be confused with the far more controversial city status that we achieved 8 years before. Last week, I also had the pleasure of seeing artwork on display at the Climate Justice School's arts exhibition in the Inverness Botanic Gardens, many of which recognise the role and importance of fair trade. Now, that display of understanding from primary schoolers across the Highlands of the intersectional inequalities which exist and how climate change impacts some people more than others was incredibly heartening. I do recall learning similar lessons when I was on a Scripture Union residential as a child looking at Fair Trade Fortnight. And what we discussed then about the power that individuals have really stuck with me. And I'm glad to know that Highland schools are taking the time to share that knowledge about the part that these children throughout their lives can play in ensuring climate justice. We're currently in March, which is also B Corp month, and while Fair Trade and B Corp certifications are different, I did want to mention both today because I think they both tie into the spirit of this debate. There are businesses across the Highlands and Islands seeking to do the right thing, to be a positive influence on the world and have a sustainable existence that plays its part in tackling climate change, exerting a force for good when it comes to working practices and social justice. From Prickly Thistle in the Black Isle to North Uist Distillery in the Western Isles, I am proud that my region continues to be a strong leader in sustainable, socially just business, certified B Corp and fair trade. At a recent reception in here hosted by SEPA celebrating the recent winners of the Vibes Scottish Environment Business Awards, which included the Highland Way, which is a zero-waste ethical coffee shop in Nairn and a favourite surgery spot of mine, I heard business leaders from across Scotland discuss how government can help them to make the right decision. Most people who seek Fair Trade or B Corp certification do so because it is the right thing to do, and they don't need a better reason than that. Although the satisfaction of their staff and their customers, the benefits of having a good reputation, and their own happiness and confidence in their impact are all common benefits. But we do have to make sure that doing the right thing doesn't disadvantage those leaders. Our international development work is something to be proud of, but individuals and businesses domestically can also make a huge difference themselves. And I ask the Scottish Government to consider whether there's more that we can do to reward that best practice that does exist in communities across Scotland. Making use of the businesses across the Highlands and Islands who are already doing their bit has been a learning curve for me, but it was surprising to me how easy and inexpensive it is to make a lot of better consumer choices. I fell into the trap when I was struggling with money of believing that making better decisions is too expensive and shopping around required time that I didn't have. And I thought that you had to be rich in both money and time to change your habits. But that's not true. And I have saved money and found new products that I enjoy by seeking out fair trade and ethical products. From swapping to laundry eggs and Palestinian olive oil, which has enriched a few of my go-to dishes, to ensuring that the coffee and the grains that I buy have that fair trade mark, very little time has been required, and often I'm actually spending less than I would on the familiar brand name. I completely understand that when you are suffering cash flow issues, when every penny counts, it is easy to go for the cheapest and the nearest and not ask any questions. But these are all symptoms of the same problem, and the cost of not doing the right thing is greater. If it's okay for what we buy here in Scotland to be the product of exploitation, then exploitation is okay. If it's okay for the UK to engage in unfair trade deals, then it's okay for other countries to subject us to unfair treatment as well. Fair wages for fair work is a principle that we cannot afford to neglect for those in the global south that we trade with or for farmers across Scotland. While we might frequently discuss the global south when it comes to fair trade, the impact of accepting exploitation and low pay is felt by us all. Without equality and fairness for everyone, there is not equality or fairness. And for the people of Scotland to enjoy high-quality products, fair work and happy lives, we must be a good global citizen. Our continued efforts on fair trade here in Scotland echo our wider campaign to be a neighbourly, cooperative country which has a positive and recognised impact on the rest of the world. And it's yet another example of how, here in Scotland, the SNP government, while undeniably held back by not having access to the full powers of an independent country, always seeks to act as we would if we were a normal, independent nation. We support and work with other countries on shared goals and principles. We play our part in influencing others and showing leadership. And we push the boundaries as far as we can, proving that we are more than capable of taking on those full powers and doing even more with them as soon as the people of Scotland back us in that aim. Thank you.
Thank you. We now move to closing speeches, and I call first Patrick Harvey. There's a little bit of time in hand, a generous 6 minutes. Mr Harvey.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. And as I expected, there were a number of very positive examples from right across the country, which I think are worth celebrating. And I want to take a minute or two to do that, because I will come on to the reasons why with very great regret. And I want to emphasise that. It seems that Parliament won't be able to unite on a final amended motion, and I think that's a shame. But those positive examples are worth celebrating for a moment, and I think from a couple of members, they started even here in Parliament with the history of the improvement of the quality of the coffee that John Mason mentioned. Locally here as well, the Fair Trade shop in Edinburgh was mentioned. A rare mention of Paisley from George Adam. He doesn't talk nearly enough about his constituency. We can all recognise that, but he finally got round to talking about Paisley. There was praise for the work of universities, including St Andrews and Edinburgh. Colin Smith told us about the cakes in Kirkcudbright, I think, if I'm reading my writing properly, and I hope he enjoyed them. I wanted to mention as well a couple of speeches, in particular by Karen Adam, gave that local example. That I think she talked about the example of uniforms. If I heard right, it was in Peterhead, but also used a phrase that I think stuck with me. Karen Adam talked about the deep solidarity that is at the heart of the fair trade movement. And I think that was a powerful expression of what I hope we want to see the global trade system move to, because this isn't about more than just a nice optional extra, something to make us feel good in the moment of buying something. This is about a provocation. This is about a systemic change. And I think Emma Roddick also reflected on that. Again, giving local examples. I think in this case, some of the art that Emma Roddick saw at the Botanics, addressing climate and also intersectional injustices. But again, a powerful phrase. Emma Roddick said that without fairness for everyone, then we won't have achieved, I think I'm paraphrasing, what the fair trade movement is intended to achieve. And this is the critical point that I hope we can all reflect on. These local examples, they're great, they're wonderful. They're feel-good, they're positive. They make people feel some empowerment by actually taking action in the face of what can often be a frighteningly disempowering world. These local examples give leadership, but they are not an end result. They're a provocation. They're a demand for wider change. I'll come back to that phrase Colin Smith used at the beginning, challenging the unfairness of conventional trade. So I think we need to accept that provocation and respond to it with the responsibility to address the systemic change that's required. Several members have talked about public procurement, and of course there is absolutely room to improve there. Of that £16 billion public procurement budget that was mentioned, I think it's clear that we don't have enough research to understand the percentage, but I'd be very surprised if anyone would counter a bet that that's going to be a very, very low percentage of that £16 billion that is going into fairly traded products. And the percentage of private spend by people and by businesses will, I suspect, be even lower. Several people talked about the scope of fair trade moving into other categories of products. And John Mason mentioned that. I'm mentioning John Mason's speech a couple of times. I do want to praise his speech. John Mason and I are people who profoundly disagree on certain other values in politics, areas where perhaps he has more in common with the allegedly pleasant Murdo Fraser. But he spoke very well on this debate and very clearly articulated the conflict that exists between free and fair trade. The freer any business is to behave in the way that it wishes, the less fair the outcome is likely to be. And John Mason mentioned clothes. Several members mentioned clothes. The impact on developing countries of the way that clothes are being produced. And if we want to change that, That can't be done through public procurement. There may be a few areas where, whether it's school uniforms or uniforms in the NHS, there may be a few areas. But if we really want to change the role of fair trade in the clothing sector, that's about changing a wider market. And it won't be done just with a handful of ethical retailers that choose to put products on the shelves. It's going to require deep and fundamental change. The idea that fast fashion could ever be compatible with an approach to fair trade, I think, is ludicrous. And so if fair trade remains merely a choice, one of many choices, alongside the unfair choices that occupy more shelf space in more outlets, then it won't ever achieve the systemic change that's required. At one point, I think Alexander Stewart was reduced to defending the idea that buying a single cup of fair trade coffee in a year is a start. It's a start. No, it's not a start. The fair trade movement started in the 1940s. The fair trade movement started in the 1940s. And if we're going to try and persuade ourselves that buying a cup of coffee a year is a start, then we will not achieve the kind of change that the fair trade movement provokes us to try and achieve. If fair trade is merely a choice, then unfair trade will remain the default. I want to finish, Presiding Officer, by making one further comment on the Conservative motion and just reflecting Conservative amendment, and just reflecting why I'm not able to support it and won't be able to support the amended motion if that amendment passes. It's not just the conflation of free and fair trade, because these concepts are, at the very least, in tension, if not in conflict. But regardless of whether you believe in a more or less well-regulated economy, a fairer or a freer one, a large single market can help to achieve either objective. So I can't possibly support an amendment which bemoans arbitrary trade barriers from a political party that imposed them, that imposed and raised those arbitrary trade barriers by taking us out of the European Union and ripping up young people's freedoms in the process. The global trade system as it stands remains far too tied to the inheritance of colonial injustices. If we seek to change that and to build a fairer global trade system and a fairer world, we're going to have to recognise that the change required is deep, and it won't be done with one cup of coffee.
Thank you. I now call on Neil Bibby, a similarly generous 6 minutes. Mr Bibby.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, for the opportunity to close this debate for Scottish Labour and to second the amendment in the name of my colleague Colin Smith. It's been a positive and constructive and, may I say, relatively pleasant debate. It's clear that the contributions today that there's significant support across the Chamber for fair trade, and I thought it was good in opening the Cabinet Secretary acknowledging the long-standing nature of this and the role of Jack McConnell in this place. It's also evident that there is significant support across Scotland, with many positive examples of work being carried out to promote fair trade. We heard powerful testimony from my colleague Faisal Chowdhury, who spoke about the impact fair trade is having in Bangladesh and how marginalised women have the opportunity to make a fair wage by creating products from upcycled saris, which are sold right here in Edinburgh. Murdo Fraser mentioned Aberfeldy becoming the first fair trade town in Scotland in 2002. Willie Rennie mentioned St Andrews. Colin Smith highlighted the work of Holy Cross School from Hamilton, who I am pleased have joined us in the gallery and stayed throughout the duration of the debate. So thank you for joining us, and many other examples of that good work from across the chamber. There are great examples in my own area too. George Adam spoke a great deal about Paisley, and Paisley becoming a fair trade town in 2003. And I also want to pay tribute, as George Adam did, to the late Provost John McDowell, who was a champion of the fair trade movement. One of the organisations he worked with, George Adam also mentioned, Rainbow Turtle. I had the pleasure of visiting them earlier this year. An excellent fair trade shop in Paisley, town centre, which has been operating since 2002, and it was great to meet with the staff and volunteers to see the variety of products that they stock and the work they're doing to sell fair trade products. I also want to highlight the work of True Origin Foods, a wholesaler in Paisley, who I also visited a few weeks ago, who work with a network of smallholder farmers and producers in the global south to source the finest ethical foods. It's important to recognise all the efforts being made to make Scotland a fair trade nation, and I echo members' thanks to all those who have volunteered their time and played a vital role in achieving this. In particular, as Colin Smith said earlier, and the Cabinet Secretary, thanks must go to the Scottish Fair Trade, led by its former Chief Executive Martin Rhodes and now by Louise Davis, for their leadership. And it's also important for us to acknowledge that this work has been replicated in other parts of the United Kingdom as well, making us part of one of the biggest fair trade markets in the world. And we heard from Murdo Fraser that in 2023, £28 million were paid from premiums from fair trade products sold in the UK. For me, Presiding Officer, I've always believed in people getting a fair day's pay for a fair day's work. That's one of the main motivations that's brought me into politics. It's why, for example, I support the New Deal for working people, strengthening employment rights, increases in the national minimum wage here. But that principle must apply internationally too. Fair trade and the fair trade premium play an integral role in ensuring that farmers and workers in the developing world receive fair pay for their produce and safer working conditions. The Cooperative Party, which I am also a member of, has been and continues to be hugely supportive of fair trade. In fact, long before it was fashionable, the cooperative movement was an early adopter of fair trade products, with the Co-op being the first supermarket to stock fair trade goods. The United Nations has designated 2025 as an International Year of Cooperatives, with the theme being Cooperatives Build a Better World. I associate myself with the Scottish Cooperative Party's belief that supporting fair trade will contribute to creating that better world. We are right, of course, to celebrate Scotland's efforts to promote fair trade, but as we look to the future, we can and should do more. And again, there was cross-party calls for this. George Adam made very valid points in his contribution, and I agree with him very much on sports equipment and the opportunity to expand fair trade products in that particular sector. Bala Sports, which you'll know, Presiding Officer, produce footballs, which the Scottish Parliament football team has used from time to time, are produced in Pakistan, and the premium paid on these footballs is used by their partners in Pakistan to provide discounted groceries for their workers. Sports bodies and clubs should do more. And I know some schools have purchased fair trade sports balls, but more can and should be done to help more schools follow suit. That leads me to procurement and the points Colin Smith made about that. We should have a standardised definition of fairly traded goods to enhance transparency and accountability in law. Alongside that, we should consider removing barriers that exist. As Colin Smith said, £16 billion is spent on public procurement in Scotland each year, but despite the best efforts of Scottish fair trade, we have little idea how much is spent on fair trade. I would say to the Cabinet Secretary and the Scottish Government, if we are serious about measuring this, then we should get serious about measuring this, and I hope the Cabinet Secretary will respond specifically to those points in closing. Presiding Officer, it's been a good debate, and we are right to mark Scotland renewing its status as a fair trade nation, but we can and must do more to ensure people around the world get a fair day's pay for a fair day's work. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Bibby. Sadly, the quality of the footballs the Scottish Parliament team use isn't matched by the quality of the performances. With that, we move on to Stephen Kerr. Again, a generous 7 minutes, Mr Kerr.
I don't really think we want to be talking about football in the chamber today, given the events of the weekend. And I am grateful to hear that John Mason considers my friend Murdo Fraser to be a relatively pleasant Tory, although Patrick Harvie did demote that estimation to allegedly pleasant Tory. I suppose it falls to me, perhaps, to become the relatively unpleasant Tory in the estimation of my colleagues. I hope not, but it wouldn't surprise me in some cases. I'm not looking in any particular direction when I say that. First of all, I want to thank the Cabinet Secretary for his speech, which I thought was a really good speech at the opening of our debate. And he rightly talked about the reputation and awareness of fair trade, and he rightly commented on the reputation of our own country when it comes to being a fair trade nation. And I thought it was in the spirit of this debate, largely, that he quoted the former First Minister, Lord McConnell, who talked about the other duty of this place to be a good neighbour and play a part in meeting global challenges. And I think that's right, because I think Scotland has always been an outward-facing and global nation. He was also right, I think, to point out that the global trading situation is in deterioration. I might come back to that if I have time in my own address. But he also commented on the work that's done, both in terms of public and private sectors working together to promote fair trade. And my colleague, Murdo Fraser, he highlighted the level of consumer awareness and consumer support there is, and I think that's a point worth making. I think later on it was actually Alexander Stewart that mentioned 97% of Scots are aware of fair trade, and I don't know if there are many things that we could honestly say that the public are aware of quite to such a high percentile as 97%, and that is a credit to the Scottish fair trade movement. I would also like to say to Colin Smith that one of the hazards of being an elected member is the enticement of too many cakes, and we all feel obliged, and I think rightly so, to taste as many of these bakeries as we can possibly consume, and I unfortunately have taken advantage of that once too often. He did try to raise the issue of a definition of fair trade, and I think that is actually something that was pertinent to this debate, because I heard some extraordinarily perverse definitions of what free trade is, from obviously a very slanted perspective. And I will hopefully come back to the issue of free trade in a moment. And I will say this about Patrick Harvey's recollection of history. It is very, very challenged, I would have to say, because he talked about how the Conservatives applauded the cuts in international aid, which, by the way, are being made in order to rearm our country in the face of the global tensions that are now the reality we have to deal with. But he did say it was the Conservatives. He said the Conservatives had said the cuts didn't go far enough. In fact, it was the Conservatives that delivered the 0.7%. No. We kept the commitment that was made by Tony Blair to get to 0.7, and we did that. That was a very important commitment that the British government kept, regardless of the colour of the rosette of the party that was in power. Blair might have set the target, but the Conservatives delivered it. We had a disturbing speech, I think, for me, from Willie Rennie, because he appeared to be willing, rather too willing, I would say, and I am deeply concerned for my friend Willie Rennie, rather too willing to agree with Patrick Harvey, and I think perhaps afterwards we need to catch up and have a chat. But George Adam, who is a tremendous champion for Paisley, no one could possibly deny that, and he mentioned sporting goods, but he didn't mention St Mirren strips. And I think perhaps I'll look forward to talking to him in committee on Thursday about whether his call for fair trade in sporting goods extends to St Mirren strips. And I'm happy to give way now to hear that it does.
As predictable as I am forever, Presiding Officer. No, I agree with him. One of the things I did say to the member, or during my speech, I agree with the member, was the fact that sporting clubs in particular need to actually lead from the front. They need to look at this issue when they're actually making sure that the shirts on their back are literally getting bought by young people, and they should be helping with this process and educating as part of that as well.
I am grateful to George Adam for making his point very clear, and that does obviously include St Mirren Football Club, which he is a great fan of, maybe the #1 fan of St Mirren Football Club that I'm aware of. And I come back to what Alexander Stewart talked about, and he's been derided by Patrick Harvey for mentioning the importance of every single step in this journey towards fair trade. I'm completely flummoxed by the attitude of Patrick Harvey towards my colleague Alexander Stewart's comment, because he's absolutely right. Every single step on this journey is absolutely critical, and getting more and more people to take more and more single steps is how we achieve the fair trade. And I'm very happy to give way to John Mason.
John Mason.
I thank the member for giving way. I mean, would he accept at least the general point that we need to raise the standard, we need to raise the bar a bit more? Because if it's just 1 cup, you know, we should be going up a bit more than that, surely.
Stephen Kerr. I don't think anyone's going to disagree with the point that John Mason's made. I'm sure we're all in favour of seeing fair trade as part of a free trade basket increase in size. I was perplexed. I like Karen Adam. I've known her a while, and she is undoubtedly one of the most genuine people in this Parliament. But to try and wheedle in references to the powers of independence when we're talking about international aid, I thought was a bit of a stretch. And Faisal Chowdhury gave us a very good potted history of fair trade in Scotland, globally and in Scotland and in Edinburgh, and he mentioned specifically Bangladesh. And Christine Graham, I think, got mixed up again in the historical reference when she talked about Great Britain. I think she got us mixed up with Belgium when she was talking about the attitude of country. I'm very happy to give way.
Christine Graham.
Is the member saying there was no exploitation of the British Empire, of the assets of these, many of these countries that are still very impoverished, and it's rather ironic now that we're having to compensate, we should compensate by fair trade, but it's the very least we can do.
Stephen Kerr, I'll give you the time back.
Well, it's undeniable that there was a British Empire, and it's undeniable that there were things that were good about that period of our history, and there were things that are to be regretted about that history. But I do think the kind of cover-all statement that Christine Graham made in her speech was unwarranted as a historic fact. And John Mason introduced us to the relatively pleasant Tory Murdo Fraser. And Emma Roddick's right, I think, when she says you don't need to be rich in time and money to make good choices. I think what people do need is information to make good choices, and I think that's exactly what the Scottish Fair Trade campaign is all about. And then finally, we got back to Patrick Harvey and his dichotomy that he created, that somehow it wasn't possible to have fair and free trade, and I completely refute that, because it is no exaggeration to say that free trade has done more to lift humanity out of poverty than any aid programme, any subsidy or any well-meaning bureaucratic intervention ever devised. And I think we must look to our own Scottish genius, Adam Smith, who gifted the world with the idea of comparative advantage, which is still to this day the most powerful idea in economics and underpins and should underpin the system of global trade. And according to the World Bank, the percentage of the global population living in extreme poverty on less than $1.90 a day fell from nearly 42% in 1981 to just 9% before the pandemic. That's over 1 billion people lifted out of destitution, not through protectionism or tariffs, but through trade, through capitalism, through enterprise. And the examples I'd call on are Vietnam, where trade liberalisation has helped reduce poverty from over 70% in the 1990s to under 6% in recent years, and Ethiopia, where exports of coffee, which have been mentioned a number of times, and textiles have opened the doors to millions of jobs, opportunities, and I think, crucially, dignity. Presiding officer, the most unfair trade practice of all is protectionism, tariffs, quotas, barriers. They do not help the poor. They keep the poor locked out. They are walls built not to keep danger out, but to keep opportunity from flowing in. And yet we see the resurgence of this failed ideology, from the European Union's labyrinth of agricultural tariffs to the Trump White House's indiscriminate use of punitive tariffs.
You do need to conclude, Mr Kerr.
We must not be shy. We must not be shy, Cabinet Secretary, in opposing protectionism. We have seen the damage that protectionism can do. And to conclude, can I just reiterate, trade is not theft. Trade, as has been said by a number of speakers, is cooperation. It is the peaceful exchange of value between people, nations and cultures, and it is one of the greatest achievements of civilization.
Thank you. I now call on Angus Robertson to wind up the debate. Cabinet Secretary, a relatively generous 9 minutes.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. And I'd like to thank all of the members who joined me here today to shine a spotlight on the incredible work happening in their constituencies and to raise the profile of fair trade here in Scotland, who have been so fundamental to Scotland gaining and retaining its fair trade nation status. Can I begin by just making the Government's position clear on the amendments, because I think we've had a relatively agreeable debate and we've had relative consensus. And I think it's important that we try and aim for maximum consensus on an issue like this. So I would signal in exactly the same way as Colin Smith did, that whilst I probably wouldn't have drafted the opposition's amendments in exactly the way that they have, the Government is going to accept the opposition amendments today. On the Labour amendment, I think it is a fair challenge to consider issues around definitions, around procurement, around education and so on, which it states in their amendment, that the Government should look at that, that the Parliament should look at that, and we should be involved in a process of constant improvement. I see absolutely nothing objectionable about that. And on the Conservative amendment, I don't really want to get involved in a debate around the relative balance of free and fair trade. I think we should be aiming for maximum freedom and maximum fairness. Is that simple? No, it's not. Is it easy to achieve? No, it's not. We can be critical of any number of trading practices in any number of countries and territorial organisations and find fault in all of that. I would draw very particular attention in the Conservative amendment to something which I think was right to be raised, which was the spectre of trade wars at the present time, the dangers of tariffs. That's something that we should be very concerned about. The people that it will harm most are the poorest in countries everywhere in the world that are hit, because they pay at the end of the day with the increase in costs for that which is imported. So whilst I wouldn't have chosen the exact wording on the Conservative amendment, Government members will be supporting the Conservative amendment. I see there's an intervention from Patrick Harvey, of course.
Patrick Harvey.
I'm grateful to the Cabinet Secretary for giving way. Clearly, I'm not expecting to change the Cabinet Secretary's mind on his voting intention at this late stage in the debate. He's made his decision. Would he at least acknowledge that, far from being a positive, trade liberalisation, as mentioned in the Conservative amendment, has far too often been forced on developing countries and has had the effect that is the opposite of what the fair trade movement seeks to achieve? And will he tell us why fair trade isn't referenced in the Government's own trade document, A Trading Nation?
Cabinet Secretary.
So, firstly, I do agree with him about the first point that he was making, but I've chosen to try and deal with that question with saying that I think it is worth pursuing a balance of maximum freedom in trading arrangements that are fair. I appreciate the warnings, both from history, the present day and what might be in the future if one doesn't get the balance right. I agree with him on that, and I think we need to work towards that. And I was going to come very specifically to the point that he made around the appearance or lack of fair trade in relation to Scottish Government trade-related documentation. He understands that trade is a reserved subject. That is not a reason why the Scottish Government should not make more reference to fair trade online and its government document. And I will definitely take that away, and officials will take that away, and we will have a very close look at that. And before that, we had, I'm looking over at Mr Smith here, in his opening speech on behalf of the Scottish Labour Party, there's one thing that I noted down in particular was in relation to definitions and the law, and I want to say very directly to him that that is something that I want to take away and better understand about what can be done there. Willie Rennie challenged me on a subject. He's not in the chamber at the. Oh, he is. He's defected to the Scottish Labour Party benches for the moment. There's not a good future in that, Mr Rennie. Saying very directly, he raised a question to me about the UK Labour government and the purchase of solar panels, which are significantly produced in parts of the People's Republic of China inhabited by the Uyghur community. I appreciate the point he's raised. I have had a look at it in the course of this debate, and I've already said to him privately in the course of today's debate that I will want to be learning more about that as an issue, because these are challenges for us all. He evidenced previous challenges for the Scottish Government and supply chain questions in trying to make sure that we're doing the right thing in terms of trade and understanding the conditions in which goods have been produced and then are exported to these shores. And that is something that we need to be very mindful of, and I want to put on record that that is something that I would wish to agree with him on. Alexander Stewart, I thought a very sensible contribution in relation to education, and fantastic to have had school students in the galleries for part of the debate today. I think the more that we can do to encourage the learning about fair trade in our schools right across the country is something that we should all be supportive of in our constituencies and our regions. Faisal Chowdhury receives my praise for him singling out Edinburgh, our great capital that we both have the joy of representing, but also a country he knows a lot about, Bangladesh, and the connections between us two out of this challenge and opportunity around fair trade. And we had other colleagues, Emma Roddick talking about Inverness, the Highland. I could go on. All contributors had much to say about that which has been achieved in relation to fair trade, but that much that more that we can do. Some of it was small steps, one cup of coffee at a time, but we can aspire to do more. I agree with all of that. But I think it's right in the 3.5 minutes that remain to me, Presiding Officer, to pay due praise, as other colleagues have done, to all of those people, the small local groups, the churches, the community organisations who've worked so hard in their local areas to make a difference in the world as well as their community. And since the taking hold of the fair trade movement, it has grown substantially. It is clear that none of the enthusiasm or the dedication of those involved has been lost along the way. Quite opposite is in fact. We have for a long time placed a great value on the role of civil society in Scotland and the appetite for global citizenship in our local communities, be that places of worship or schools or businesses, to name but a few. This local effort is an important part of how Scotland contributes globally to delivery of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, and has an important place alongside the work of governments, of parliaments and others, a point reflected on recently in an article on the Edinburgh Evening News ahead of this debate, which I would commend all members to read. It was especially wonderful to hear about the initiatives being taken forward to engage more young people in fair and sustainable global issues such as fair trade. It is vital that the fair trade movement remains relevant and sustainable into the future. And I want to leave all colleagues at the end of this debate with hopefully 3 key messages that we are all in agreement on, regardless of how we're going to vote at the end of our proceedings. The first is our long-standing commitment to being a good global citizen. We are currently in an increasingly contested and volatile space for international development. Scotland is a nation that seeks to lead by example, and this means standing up for the values, standing up for that which shapes both our domestic and our international work. Ensuring that fairness, equality and inclusion are at the heart of everything, and that the voices of those less privileged than us are heard and are acted on. That is why today is so important. It isn't just about what we are doing and saying in Scotland to promote fair trade. Today is about amplifying the voice of the producers, the workers and enterprises in the Global South, and standing in solidarity with them to build a fairer and more sustainable trading system. The second message I want to leave all of us with is our steadfast commitment to delivering for our African partner countries. Our International Development Fund has been led by our partners, ensuring our portfolio is aligned with their national priorities to maximise impact. This has resulted in our programming focusing on often neglected and underfunded areas such as inclusive education, non-communicable diseases and tackling gender-based violence, delivered through grants rather than loans. And this is key given the debt repayment crisis so many African countries face at this time, including our own partner countries. As the world shifts and strains around us, we remain resolute in our commitment to our partners, and fair trade is a key part of that. And lastly, I want to leave all of us with a call to action. As I said at the start, fair trade nation status isn't just a title. The assessment report challenges us to go further, not just to maintain this status in the future, but to set an example to the next generation about what good global citizenship is and the important role that fair trade plays in that. I thank members for their input today and look forward to working across the Chamber to deliver for Scotland and our partner countries.
Thank you. Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. That concludes the debate on Scotland, a fair trade nation. It's now time to move on to the next item of business. Point of order, Douglas Lumsden.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. In less than 22 hours' time, this Parliament will be debating Stage 1 of the Land Reform Scotland Bill. Standing Orders Rule 9.6 states, 3.a, the lead committee shall report to the Parliament in time to allow the report to be published not later than the 5th sitting day before any day allocated in a business programme for the Parliament to consider the general principles of the bill under paragraph 4. The Net Zero and Transport Committee published a report on the bill as introduced on the 19th of March. Now, from my calculations, this does not meet the timescale set out in Rule 9.63a. Further, Presiding Officer, as yet there has been no government response to the committee report. In the protocol on the handling of the committee business, there is a section titled Responses to Committee Reports. Rule 41 states the Scottish Government should normally respond to any committee report not later than A, 2 months after publication of the report, or B, where exceptionally the debate is to be within 2 months of publication, a week before the Chamber debate the report. The committee did give advance sight of the report to the Government to try and avoid the situation that we now find ourselves in. Presiding Officer, I am sure you will agree that these rules and protocols are in place to make sure that we can have meaningful debate where members have time to read both committee view and the Government's response. In light of the fact that Standing Order 9.6 has not been met and the fact that there is no response from Government as per Rule 41 of the Protocol on the Handling of Committee Business, can you confirm that the debate scheduled for tomorrow can indeed take place?
I thank Mr Lumsden for his point of order. I will look into the issues that the member has raised and I will respond as quickly as possible. We move on to decision time. There are 3 questions to be put as a result of today's business. The first is that Amendment 16923.1, in the name of Murdo Fraser, which seeks to amend Motion 16923 in the name of Angus Robertson on Scotland, a fair trade nation, be agreed. Are we all agreed? I'm just going to ask again, are we all agreed? The Parliament is not agreed, therefore we'll move to a vote and there will be a short suspension to allow members to access the digital voting system.